July 1945. A Third Army training facility near Heidelberg, Germany. Summer heat hung thick over the red brick barracks. In the central courtyard, a group of 40 American soldiers sat on wooden benches under the shade of 3 old oak trees. They wore olive-drab trousers and sweat-stained undershirts. They were cleaning rifles. A truck engine idled in the distance. A staff car moved past the main gate. The war in Europe had been over for 2 months. The guns were quiet. The fields were green. It looked like a peaceful base in Georgia or Texas. But a formal paper lay on the desk of the camp commandant. It was a proposal. It carried 22 pages of neat, typed German text with an English translation attached. It asked for an audience with the commanding general. It promised to fix a problem the writer believed the Americans could not solve on their own. Patton's answer would arrive before the ink on that formal request was fully dry. This is the story of a captured German lieutenant colonel who demanded to lecture American generals, and what happened when the loser still thinks he is the master. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happens when the loser still thinks he is the master. Sergeant Major Walter Bryant was 38 years old. He came from Mobile, Alabama. He was a graduate of the Tuskegee Institute, a man who built his life on precision and study. For 17 years, the United States Army had been his home, his arena, and his burden. He had served as a combat NCO in Italy with the 92nd Infantry Division, leading men through the mud and fire of the Gothic Line. He had seen friends die in the ridges. He carried a jagged shrapnel scar across his left shoulder, a permanent reminder of an artillery barrage near Lucca. Now, he was the senior non-commissioned officer instructor at the Heidelberg facility. He was tasked with shaping the next generation of small unit leaders. His students were a mixed group of 40 black and white sergeants drawn from various combat units across the Third Army. Bryant stood straight. His boots shined to a mirror gloss, his 3 bronze stars pinned neatly to his chest. He knew his job, and he knew his worth. Oberstleutnant Friedrich Hess was 47 years old. He came from Berlin, Germany. He was a general staff officer, an elite graduate of the prestigious Kriegsakademie, the intellectual brain trust of the Wehrmacht. For 22 years, Hess had served in operational planning, helping to map the movements of armies and army groups. He had co-authored internal doctrinal documents and spent the summer of 1940 planning the rapid advance through France. He wore a tailored gray uniform, stripped of its swastika but still immaculate, and his leather boots were polished by a submissive camp orderly. Hesse considered himself a direct heir to the military genius of Clausewitz and Moltke. To him, the Americans were amateurs who had won the war solely through numbers and material wealth. He sat in his secure quarters, entirely detached from the reality of his nation's total defeat, drafting a 16-lecture syllabus designed to teach American generals how to fight. By July 1945, the map of Europe was carved into occupation zones, and the ruins of the Third Reich were crawling with millions of displaced persons, Allied troops, and captured enemy soldiers. The grand strategic machinery of the German army had ground to a complete halt, its ministries burned, its high command in chains. Yet inside the prisoner of war enclosures, a strange parallel reality began to take shape. Scores of high-ranking Wehrmacht planners, logistics experts, and staff officers sat in secure compounds, isolated from the devastated cities outside. They looked at the rising tension between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, and they saw an opportunity. Many of these officers believed their specialized knowledge of Eastern Front tactics made them indispensable assets to the American military. In the chaos of the immediate post-war months, some American commanders let this attitude slide. Eager to gather intelligence on Soviet capabilities, certain intelligence sections began coddling cooperative German staff officers, providing them with extra rations, comfortable quarters, and secretarial support to write long operational memoirs. It was an environment where a captured colonel could easily forget he was a prisoner. They treated the end of the war not as a moral and physical annihilation, but as a temporary operational pause. They assumed the Americans would naturally want to learn from the masters of the Blitzkrieg. The formal proposal from the Heidelberg compound traveled up through the bureaucratic layers of the Third Army, passing from the camp commandant to the intelligence desk, growing heavier with every signature. The document was an ultimatum wrapped in a polite request demanding an audience with the top commanders of the American forces. The compound office was quiet until Captain Thomas Miller, a 32-year-old intelligence officer from Chicago, placed the typed document on his desk. He looked across at Hess, who stood with his hands folded behind his back. "This proposal is highly detailed, Oberstleutnant," Miller said. "It is a complete syllabus," Hess answered. 16 lectures covering deep battle doctrine, logistical synchronization, and armored thrusts. "You have requested an audience with General Patton," Miller noted, flipping a page. "And you specified your audience must be colonels and above." "Naturally," Hesse said, his head tilting up. "My material is operational theory. It is the culmination of 22 years of general staff work. It is designed for those who command armies, not the men who merely grease the tanks. Our regulations for cooperative prisoners allow for intelligence debriefings," Captain Miller said, his voice flat. "They do not typically include an honorarium or a lecture tour. With respect, Captain, you are facing a new reality in the East," Hess replied, stepping closer to the desk. "The Soviet Union employs methods our staff analyzed for 4 years. Your army won this war through mass production, not tactical sophistication. Your senior commanders are amateurs in continental maneuver. They require this instruction." Captain Miller stood up, his face hardening as he closed the folder. "You are a prisoner of war, Colonel Hess. You do not dictate terms to the United States Army, nor do you select your students based on your social theories." Hesse smiled faintly, tapping his polished leather boot against the floorboards. "I am an officer of the General Staff, Captain. If my expertise is to be utilized, it must be done properly. I will not squander these concepts on common soldiers who lack the education to grasp them. If the General wishes to understand how to defeat the Red Army, he will grant the interview." Miller took the folder from the desk. "I will forward this to G2, he said, "but I suggest you adjust your expectations." "It is not an expectation," Hess said. "It is a necessity for your army." The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top Jeep pulled up to the Heidelberg headquarters building with a sharp screech of tires. The 4 silver stars on his helmet caught the afternoon light, and the ivory handles of his revolvers rested against his hips. The general walked into the commandant's office unannounced. The officers in the room snapped to attention instantly, their boots striking the floor. Patton did not tell them to stand at ease. His eyes were cold, fixed entirely on the folder in his hand. He looked at Captain Miller, then down at the syllabus drafted by the German colonel. "Bring the German in here," Patton said. His voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. Hess entered a minute later. He clicked his heels and bowed his head slightly. "You wrote this proposal, Colonel?" Patton asked. "I did, General," Hess said. "It is a comprehensive framework for operational success." "You believe my senior officers need your instruction?" Patton asked, his voice dropping an octave. "I believe your army lacks experience in large-scale continental warfare against a modern opponent," Hess replied, his chin rising. "My lectures would bridge that gap." Patton studied him for a long moment. He looked at the tailored uniform, the polished boots, and the unearned confidence of a man whose army lay in ruins. "You have a choice, Colonel," Patton said. "You will deliver these 16 lectures, exactly as you have scheduled them, starting Monday morning at 9 o'clock. But you will not be speaking to colonels. You will deliver every word of this doctrine to Sergeant Major Walter Bryant and his 40 NCO students at the Heidelberg training facility. You will receive no honorarium. Your participation is now a mandatory detail of your labor." Hesse froze. His face went pale. "American NCOs?" he asked. "Non-commissioned soldiers? Of mixed race?" "2 options," Patton said, leaning forward slightly. "You walk into that classroom on Monday morning and you teach those sergeants everything you know. Or you can spend the next 8 weeks clearing rubble from the streets of Mannheim with a hand shovel under a combat guard. Decide now." Hesse looked at the general's hard eyes. He looked at the 4 silver stars. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He nodded once, stiffly. "I will deliver the lectures," Hess said. On Monday morning, the verdict was executed in full view of the Heidelberg staff. A pair of armed American military policemen escorted Hess into the wooden lecture hall. He wore his stripped Wehrmacht gray, his fingers tightly clutching his neatly typed notes. 40 American sergeants sat at long wooden tables arranged in a sharp semicircle. Half of the faces in the room were black, half were white, and all of them watched the German officer with cold, unblinking discipline. Sergeant Major Walter Bryant stood beside the blackboard, his uniform pressed to a sharp line. He did not salute the prisoner. He stepped forward and addressed the room in a clear, resonant voice. "Good morning," Bryant said. "This morning, Lieutenant Colonel Hess of the former Wehrmacht will deliver the first of 16 lectures on German operational doctrine. The lectures are part of our study program on enemy tactics. Please give him your full attention. After the lecture, we will conduct a mandatory 30-minute question-and-answer session. Every student must ask at least one substantive question. Lieutenant Colonel Hess, you may begin." Hesse stood behind the small wooden podium. The room smelled of floor wax, pine oil, and cheap tobacco. He looked out at the rows of decorated combat veterans who had broken his army, cleared his notes, and began to speak. Sergeant Major Walter Bryant remained in the United States Army for nearly 2 more decades. Retiring in 1962, he returned to Mobile, Alabama, where he spent 20 years serving as a dedicated junior high school principal, shaping young minds with the same quiet discipline he had used to manage his troops. He passed away in 1991. Tucked away on the top shelf of his home library was a privately published German book, its pages worn but intact. A permanent testament to the summer his classroom rewrote a German officer's understanding of professionalism. Oberstleutnant Friedrich Hess was transferred to a general prisoner population later that year and was finally released from custody in 1948. He returned to a fractured Germany, eventually finding work as a doctrine consultant for the newly established Bundeswehr in 1956. In his later years, he penned a limited-run memoir titled What I Learned at Heidelberg, a book explicitly dedicated to Sergeant Major Walter Bryant, which Hess sent to Alabama as a quiet token of respect. He lived out his remaining days in a quiet suburb of Bonn, dying in 1974. General George S. Patton never mentioned the incident in his public briefings, nor did he include it in his personal diary entries that summer. The official paperwork regarding Hesse's 16 lectures was filed away in a low-priority intelligence drawer at the 3rd Army headquarters, marked simply as routine prisoner utilization. Years later, an archivist found a single scrap of paper attached to the original syllabus with a short, handwritten note from the general, stating that true mastery is demonstrated in the results, not in the pedigree. Some military historians have argued that Patton's handling of the German staff officer was an unnecessary degradation of a highly valuable intelligence asset, suggesting that Hesse's deep understanding of continental maneuver could have been better utilized by senior American planners during the initial stages of the Cold War. Others have countered that the general's decision was a masterful stroke of psychological demilitarization, arguing that it successfully crushed the lingering arrogance of the Wehrmacht general staff without wasting their technical expertise. What remains a matter of certain historical record is that the 16 lectures delivered at Heidelberg provided the American non-commissioned officer corps with an exceptionally detailed first-hand analysis of German operational vulnerabilities. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have allowed the German officer to speak to the generals? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about when the loser still thinks he is the master, make sure to subscribe.